afternoon, good evening. My name is Sonia Rastogi. I'm the Gender-Based Violence Knowledge Management Specialist based at UNICEF, and I also work for the GBV Guidelines Implementation Support Team. It's my pleasure to moderate and open up this webinar for all of you today. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers. We will open with a presentation from Ilan Sernaturov. Ilan is a researcher focused on child and adolescent health and child protection with a focus on vulnerable groups in humanitarian settings. He's currently pursuing a PhD at London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, where his work focuses on the relationship between natural disasters and violence against children and the adaptation of methods for humanitarian contexts. He'll be presenting his research on the pathways between natural disasters and experiences of violence and implications for humanitarian practice. After Ilan, we will then hear from Ranjini Raman, who is the Asia Pacific Senior Protection, Gender and Inclusion Officer and Sexual and Gender-Based Violence Advisor for the International Federation of the Red Cross. In her role, Ranjini supports protection, gender, and inclusion work throughout the Asia-Pacific region, and she will be sharing findings from IFRC's research on sexual and gender-based violence, along with the programming and response that had manifested as a result of these research efforts. And finally, Hannah Tina Fisher is a researcher focused on the impact of adversity on children's well-being and development, analyzing risk and resilience as functions of family-level system adaptation to crises. Tina is a DRPH candidate at the Mailman School of Public Health at Columbia University and is a senior research associate of the CPC Learning Network. She's a contributor to the Pathways article that Ilan will be presenting on and will contribute during our Q&A session. And with that, I would like to thank the Alliance and the CPC Learning Network for providing us this opportunity to discuss these really critical issues. And I will hand it over to Ilan to open up with his presentation.
Hello, my name is Ilan Sernaturov. I will be discussing a piece of research that we have just implemented to understand and identify how natural disasters might lead to violence against children. In thinking about this, we decided to conduct a systematic review of academic and gray literature reports by humanitarian agencies, as well as soliciting directly recommendations from key focal points globally to try to find out original research on reasons why violence may increase and or articles that modeled how natural disasters lead to violence. And we looked specifically at physical, emotional, and sexual violence only, not other protection concerns, because we wanted to be very specific in pinpointing violence. This search yielded 6,276 unique texts, of which 26 fit our ultimate inclusion criteria. In this, we then took that information and sorted it into 5 possible pathways for how this may occur. These pathways, the first of which is supervision, accompaniment, and child separation. Now, this is about often gendered patterns of movements where we have girls who are traveling longer distances unaccompanied to search for firewood and water, or going at odd times. So you see girls reporting that they would often go at night to collect water to avoid the queues during the day, which are directly a result of the natural disaster, these changes in movement. In Ethiopia and Kenya, you would also see reports from a lot of affected communities of children being left unsupervised at home for longer time periods, mainly because their mothers were going out to do the same activities that I mentioned for girls, but also fathers were away for a long time, often further than they would normally go for income generation. In contrast, in the South Pacific, there was a lot of discussion of positive community safety nets. So in Papua New Guinea, children traveled together in mixed gender groups to fetch water, and various typhoons initiated them and mobilized joint family structures so that these would be protected in watching children. The second pathway that we identified was transgression of social norms. So by this, we mean that children are being perceived as acting outside of the bounds of modesty or normalcy because of contextual factors related to the natural disaster. In this, you would see, for instance, after 2015, the earthquake in Nepal, young girls and women were sleeping on the roofs of their households during menstruation to avoid polluting, quote unquote, their households, because this was a sort of social norm that existed beforehand, but because of the earthquake, they no longer had another space or a private space where they could go. So they would sleep on rooftops, increasing sexual violence risk. In Somalia, with young boys, gender norms really heavily dictated that boys would be supporting their households in raising funds during this time of hardship with the drought. But because of limited economic opportunities, they couldn't. And that was often resulting in physical violence of them being beaten for not being able to return income and support their families, all of which directly related to these natural disaster events. A third pathway that we identified was economic stress. So by this we mean the stress of losing livelihood or the changes in dynamics in income generation. You very heavily see this with male economic providers, adult males within households, and obviously this is assuming sort of normal like the how do you say, like a family structure that would have parents and children, a nuclear family. You would see, with male economic providers in Laos, Bangladesh, and Nepal that there was often reports of stress and acting out violence against children. But you would also see this from adult women. So in Bangladesh, after flooding, actually the most common perpetrators of violence, physical and emotional violence against children, were mothers. And I really like this one quote from the same study of parents in quoting why they would be acting out because of economic stress. One parent says, "My child asked me in the morning to bring back cookies when I went out to search for work. It was happening sometimes when we could only afford to eat once a day. So how could I buy cookies? I couldn't control myself and I slapped the child." So a very poignant description of how the stress of not being able to provide for their families was overwhelming them and they sort of lashed out. And that really relates to, but is slightly different from the fourth pathway, which is this negative coping with stress. This is more of what we would probably think of the traditional humanitarian thinking of mental health, where there's traumatic events and you cope with it in not the best ways at points, right? So substance abuse, mental health disorders that develop, negative coping in various ways. And you would see this very commonly in the literature talked about in families and households as a sort of private acting out of violence, but also with other children in the community. So again, going to Papua New Guinea, hungry children were stealing vegetables from neighboring plots, and the adults would beat the children, but because the children were so hungry, they would keep going back to steal these vegetables, and sort of this kind of acting out of these adults unable to really cope with the situation and acting out against these children. And last pathway that we identified was around insecure shelter and living conditions. So this would be more of the traditional domain of shelter and wash clusters, and just in general could be within a displacement camp or within communities that have not been displaced by a disaster event. But the physical environment around the conditions of houses, latrines, bathing facilities, and you would see respondents talking about flimsy tarp materials as tents, a lack of locks on the doors or latrines, a lack of lighting in their households, latrines, or the routes to go to public areas or to bathing facilities. And these structural elements, it's important to mention that they may have existed before the disaster event, particularly in poor communities, that these types of insecurities may have always been there. But what we're seeing is that simply women and girls, due to disasters, often have reduced mobility, and that reduced mobility in turn exacerbates this risk. Many of you may have already come across these elements and what we're calling pathways in this webinar, and you may have come across these in this work. The question is then, how is this useful for practice? And I'm going to take the example of violence being committed by adult men in households. In this slide, you see a physical mapping of different pathways, right? And this is a conceptual understanding of what we've drawn up from the literature. Now, let's say you identify the key pathway to violence in your specific context is through economic stress. Within this, adult male economic providers, the intervention that we might need if we were targeting this group was that we might want to do some sort of psychosocial intervention which targets the traditional gender norms, which dictate that men need to provide for their families. And what does that mean in the context of a natural disaster? And what alternatives are there for coping for that stress? So that might be one sort of intervention we could develop. Let's say, though, in another setting, we're seeing the really dominant route through which violence is happening is because of negative coping with stress. And adult men in this context are abusing substances. It may mean that our intervention is differently designed for substance abuse counseling, for various psychosocial elements that target the ways in which men are acting out in that context, which are different than those of economic stress. So this conceptual map, it illustrates helpful for us in thinking about how we design our interventions. Because ultimately, in order to prevent violence, we need to block the specific pathway that's driving why the violence is occurring. And it also highlights that more than one pathway may exist. So in thinking about our programming, we need to develop and ensure there's coordination between different services to provide interventions to block all of the different pathways by which violence may occur. Thank you. This was a very quick overview, and I hope helpful in thinking through why this type of research is helpful in doing and sort of thinking about these findings and mapping for driving practice. And please reach out to us if you'd like to hear more or receive a copy of our forthcoming article when published. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ilan. Thank you for providing us with such a strong foundation and kicking us off on these pathways and what you found from your research.
My name is Ranjani. I am the Protection, Gender, and Inclusion Officer and the Gender-Based Violence Advisor for the IFRC. I'm based in Bangkok, Thailand, but I work for the Asia Pacific region. And I'm just going to share a little bit about the research done by the IFRC on sexual and gender-based violence, completed in 2018 in Laos, Philippines, and Indonesia. We've also conducted this research recently last year in Cambodia and Vietnam. And this was done in collaboration with the ASEAN, which is the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, Committee on Disaster Management, Prevention, and Mitigation Working Group. This research was conducted with over 1,400 disaster-affected individuals through household surveys, focus group discussions, and key informant interviews disaggregated by gender and age. I'll also give a brief overview of the Red Cross Red Crescent response programming based on the findings from this research, as well as community recommendations that we received through the focus group discussion. We know through case studies and anecdotal evidence from the field that violence increases in emergencies, and the research that Ilan presented backs up the presumption we make as humanitarian actors, that SGBV is always happening in any context, and it's exacerbated by disasters. Some of the reasons why violence increases in disasters includes that there's a breakdown of normally functioning protective systems, such as mental health and legal protection. There's also a loss of livelihoods due to natural disasters or loss of belongings, separation from family members, or loss of loved ones, which causes increased community stress. Increased stress can lead to harmful coping mechanisms such as alcohol and drug abuse. We found in Laos, for example, that after the collapse of the dam in Apapu, that women noted there was increased violence and tension in the home after a collapsed bridge was restored, which reestablished markets, and there were an increase in influx of goods, which included alcohol and cigarette. And many women shared that this led to an increase in violence in the home, as well as crowded, insecure living conditions in temporary shelters leads to increased violence because often women and children are forced to live in close quarters with people they don't know, or there's a lack of adherence to sphere safety standards, which includes like locks on toilets, adequate lighting, etc. And the fact that violence is a pre-existing risk in every country, regardless of a disaster. And I just want to note on this slide that while these things are factors that exacerbate and contribute to violence, the root cause of sexual gender-based violence is gender inequality and an abuse of power. So these things listed here are not the reason for violence themselves. It's always harmful gender norms caused by gender inequality and an abuse of power. So the purpose of this research in 2018 was to understand how SGBV affects women, girls, boys, and men differently during disasters, to map essential SGBV response services in the health, legal, security, and psychosocial sectors that remain functioning during a disaster, and also to document how public authorities and humanitarian actors have responded to disaster-affected communities in the area of response, and also to collect recommendations for improvement and best practices from the community. This is just a select sample of data from the research disaggregated by gender, just to give you an idea of some of the info that was captured. Early marriage and domestic violence were the most prevalent forms of SGBV for women and girls, and this is taken from the Lao context, whereas men and boys cited a fear of communal violence as the most prevalent form of violence. You'll see here that 29% of men and boys cited domestic violence as occurring after the disaster, and this is not shown on the slide, but it was noted mostly by young boys that domestic violence occurred in home caused by parents or siblings. Even though there's lack of data here around how men and boys reacted to early marriage, respondents hearing of someone had been raped after disaster or been injured, this is only for the Lao context. So from different countries, we also had reports from men and boys around these areas of sexual gender-based violence. And men and boys, as well as women and girls, all cited lack of awareness of what SGBV is and access to better coping mechanisms and counseling as a way to prevent violence. I just want to reiterate that the root cause of SGBV is gender inequality and an abuse of power. And this is important to remember because we all often talk about some of the reasons why violence is increased, but it's really important to remember what the root cause is, because as humanitarian actors, sometimes we focus on short-term response, which is necessary, but programmatic focus on long-term behavioral change is what is key. The main issues cited by respondents during the household surveys and focus group discussions closely align with some of the things that Ilan shared in his presentation, which was that there were unsafe and insecure living conditions in temporary shelters, which include lack of secure and separate toilets, or being displaced from the home and not having any sort of government provided temporary shelter, living with people they did not know. There's a breakdown in support services, and also many people noted that they were not aware of what services existed for support. And many people often went to the village leader dispute resolution, and village leaders often favor perpetrators in their resolution. So many people were not aware that there were other services that existed that were being provided by either organizations that were there temporarily or government programs that were there long-term. From this research, the Red Cross Red Crescent has implemented several interventions. Some are focused internally on our programs and our staff, and also some are focused toward the community based on community recommendations. IFRC has a publication titled The Minimum Standards for Protection, Gender and Inclusion in Emergencies, which outlines basic principles of gender-inclusive programming in alignment with the SPEAR standards and the Interagency Standing Committee GBV guidelines. We recommend the Red Cross Red Crescent staff use this guide in emergency response and program development where it's applicable. The prevention of SGBV and better response during emergencies requires better preparedness among local Red Cross Red Crescent chapters and local organizations. UNICEF, IOM, and IFRC held a joint workshop in Bangkok in September to link our local teams for better preparedness planning and to train our staff on SGBV. IFRC also supports local chapter meetings with, for example, psychosocial service providers and other local humanitarian actors in remote locations that may be there temporarily or have permanent staff to better prepare for coordination during an actual emergency. SGBV sensitization and survivor-centered approach trainings for Red Cross Red Crescent staff focuses on dismantling prevalent harmful gender norms as well as training Red Cross Red Crescent staff and volunteers on how to work with survivors if they come across them, to protect their dignity, access, participation, and safety. As the Red Cross is typically first responders in an emergency, we had many staff tell us that people would share instances of violence with them and they weren't sure what to do or where to send a survivor. So this was an important key in our intervention in terms of immediate change in our response programming to ensure that we knew where to direct people if they disclosed an instance of violence to us. And also the development of standard operating procedures. This was done in collaboration with government and local NGOs providing services to create a well-known and functioning referral pathway that is supported and approved of by the local government, which leads to better functionality during times of disaster when it is a program that the government is supportive of. From the community, some of the recommendations from the discussion, which we have implemented in the Philippines, Indonesia, and Laos, is improved psychosocial counseling. So in all countries, all groups, women, men, boys, and girls, mention the need for Sgtp information in schools or in their workplace, and support groups and one-on-one counseling during times of emergency. In Indonesia, the focus is primarily on prevention because the stigma against survivors is very harmful, especially in Aceh, where we conduct our programming. And Aceh is a community that is under Sharia law. So when working with the Red Cross chapter there, they informed us that prevention should be the primary focus because after an incident, the stigma is just too great. We do that prevention programming through some acronyms here that I've listed, which I'm not sure are well known outside of the Red Cross, I'm not sure, but YABC stands for Youth as Agents of Behavior Change. And this program is working with youth to discuss what are the most prevalent forms of Sgtp in their community. They write a play together and they perform that play in different rural communities, as well as ECBHFA programming, which is community-based health and first aid, which is health programming. So we've inserted violence prevention programming as part of the long-term health programming, which focuses like on hand washing and things like that. So having a violence prevention component as part of that, as well as having a functional referral pathway that is developed in conjunction with the government and local agencies, and sharing that with the community so that they know who to call and where to go to for any violence that they experience, when that's possible. It's not always possible. The recent areas of work for the Red Cross Red Crescent where we have implemented the recommendations from the research are in the Lao dam collapse in Afapu, Laos, in the Lombok and Sulawesi earthquake and tsunami response, as well as the population movement operation in Cox's Bazar. Even though this research was conducted in 5 Southeast Asian countries, many of the research recommendations are applicable to many countries around the world. And our programming currently is developing operational guidelines for the Philippines Red Cross and the Indonesian Palang Merah Indonesia, which is the Indonesian Red Cross, as well as stronger psychosocial support services for survivors, and the 2 violence prevention programs that I shared, YABC and ECBHFA. And most recently, which I haven't mentioned yet, in the Philippines, we will be implementing a livelihood intervention for long-term violence prevention. It's the start of a village savings loan and association for 2 communities in the Philippines, which focuses on the fact that loss of livelihoods affects men primarily, as they are quote-unquote primary breadwinners in their community. And this focuses on livelihood interventions for men and women. Oftentimes, livelihood interventions focus only on women, which increases intimate partner violence because there's a shift in the gender dynamic at home. So the VSLA will focus on both men and women as a livelihood intervention.
Thank you so much, Ranjini. And thank you, Ranjini and Ilan, for your really insightful presentations and all of the hard work that you've done. We are going to go into Q&A right now, and I would like to dive into the conversation. Feel free to put questions in the chat. I've seen 1 or 2, which I've taken note of. And also you have a raise hand function to come off of mute and ask your question. But before we get into that, I would like to ask Ilan and Tina a question to kick us off. And I'll go ahead and put up your pathways slides here as well so the audience can follow along. Tina and Ilan, how can humanitarian actors better incorporate individual, family, and community resilience in structuring response? I think this is something that is a lot of interest to me, and I'm sure many others on the line for our programming.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very big and I think very important question. There's quite a few things we can do in terms of looking at how we can better incorporate aspects of resilience in responses. And I think to start with, it's understanding that resilience is not actually just a characteristic of an individual or a family or a community. You know, we'll often see descriptions of, oh, well, this is a resilient child or this is a resilient community, but actually understand resilience as a transaction between that child or that family or that community and their wider environment. So both the social and the physical environment. And I think the findings that we had from the review really pointed to, for example, violence as an outcome being a transaction that relates to changes that occurred in the different environments that the affected people were in. So if we stop sort of looking at how we can teach resilience to children, for example, or teach families how to be resilient, but instead understand what is it that we can do to see how we can help them navigate the changes in their environment that may present risks, that's one we can incorporate more resilience lens. It also moves away from, you know, what you could call like a very biomedical focus on the individual. And I think this is something we've typically had when we do assessments. We would look at specifically, for example, the levels of PTSD or trauma after a natural disaster or an extreme weather event, or we'll look at the number of separated children. But what we're not necessarily doing at the same time, and I think this is what I think we would encourage, is to look at how did other aspects of the social and physical environment change. The individual isn't just there on their own, but they're actually part of a family and they're part of a community, and those communities are facing different changes, and that necessarily has an effect on that individual and on that family. So trying to essentially see things in context, but context not just meaning, I think how we often see it as humanitarian responders is sort of the political economy, where we describe the aspects or characteristics of the country, but actually context being the direct environment in which individuals, families, and communities are living. And I think the third thing I would raise related to this, and this was touched on both by what Ilan presented, but also Ranjani, is essentially this notion of agency, and resilience, of course, being very tightly related to this, but understanding that actors will do things, will make decisions based on the environments they're in and the changes that have happened. And we can view those as maladaptive, or we can view those as negative, but essentially there is a rationale behind different actions that have happened, and they're based on the agency of individuals and families in that context. So how can we understand that, or better understand that, and really work with those decisions to ultimately promote protective environments for children? So really respecting the fact that people and family and communities will act in ways that they feel is their best interest, and what risks might arise in that context, and how can we help them navigate this? Ilan, do you have any further thoughts?
You definitely covered that very well. I mean, I would just say, I think it was interesting that in certain contexts, we were finding actually communities saying that violence did not increase or violence decreased. And I think that as humanitarians, we need to take particular note of those instances where things are actually okay. What could we learn from those? How can we replicate it? Because I feel that if we continue to go in with certain box models and don't actually think about the structures, it's disempowering for those communities. It's also less effective. I mean, communities may already be doing things that are great responses, and how can we support that in our programming? I think that's a big question that came out of this for me, is that when are the instances where we could actually do more with local responses that may have existed for thousands of years if it's a repeat type of disaster that happens annually, and how can we support those?
Maybe just to add one point to what Ilan just shared, which I think is really, really critical, is also having a moment of reflection to see how our actions might actually be undermining some of what Ilan just shared. Some of these mechanisms, or you could say, you know, organically occurring actions or thought processes or beliefs or whatever it might be that are actually protective, that we might not be aware of in our response, but our ways of engaging. A classic example of this would be the direct sort of service provision of certain products or foods or whatever, not actually perhaps understanding the importance of self-sufficiencies to a certain group, and how, you know, culturally the reciprocity is a core aspect of how they gain agency and gain empowerment. And perhaps by this direct delivery or the means we choose, we might actually be undermining some of that power.
Thank you so much, both. The question is, what is the most surprising thing that you've learned through your research for both of the projects?
Sure. I actually think this relates maybe a little bit to what Ilan and Tina were just talking about now. But we found that in some of the countries where we did the research, people said that they also shared that violence tended to decrease, or they noted in their own home that violence decreased after the disaster. And the reason they cited was because that they and their partner or their family were so focused on how to recover from the immediate effects of the disaster that the typical disputes that they had and the violence decreased in the home. But then we asked questions about, well, what about 1 month later or 2 months later? And then there was a return to the norm. And then some of those pathways that Ilan and Tina were discussing and some of those exacerbating factors tended to increase violence. So I think it is true that in every context it's a little bit different, but as humanitarian actors, we are always, and humanitarian actors that are focused specifically on gender inclusive and gender responsive programming, operate around the assumption that violence always exists and that it does increase in times of disaster. I think that was a surprising finding and also was a nuance of the fact that we operate on in our work.
I think 2 points. I mean, one, adding to what Ranjini was saying, I think it's this interesting thing because, right, the underlying risks, we know that violence against women, violence against children is often very high in a lot of these contexts before the disaster happens, right? I think then it's not that the risk doesn't necessarily exist, but if there are instances where we can bolster what's already happening, that is something that seems very effective and something that seemed to, in the ways in which communities were talking about it, they were saying all of these things and highlighting with pride oftentimes things that they were already doing. So, and you know, in the ways in which often the reports or the articles were talking about it was not as much like recognizing that communities already do that. So for me, that was a bit surprising that these communities already were saying things that maybe we weren't listening to, right? That could be very helpful. But the second point, I think, for me, that was quite interesting from a lot of the literature, well, this part about social norms and just how actions were being perceived. So that people were acting in ways that were adaptive to the environment, doing things that they needed to continue on in their daily lives. But because they sort of differed from what the norm would be before, other people were interpreting them as transgressive in some way. And so I'll give this one example. It's again from Bangladesh, but these young girls were talking about having to go to work and trying to go to work, and they would have to wade through very deep water. And so every time this would happen, their saris would very much cling to their bodies, and these young boys would be taunting them and harassing them, and you know, girls would be like, and being actual acts of sexual violence happening. You know, that relates to social norms in that place, right? The underlying gender norms that are unequal, as Ranjini was saying, that there's ways in which perception about women's bodies that's quite, you know, that's not exactly, well, it's not progressive, that's not it, but the actual natural disaster itself made it worse, right? It brought out this new thing that was being perceived as these girls acting in sexually provocative ways because of having to go through the floodwater. And I just thought that was very interesting, of like something we don't, I think, as much deal with in our current structures of humanitarian programming, is how these social norms are being perceived, how a disaster could yield to these differences in perception.
Just to comment on the quality of evidence we actually have to answer these very important questions, how actually some of the data that we have does challenge, as Ranjini said, some of the assumptions we have. Ranjini shared a number of studies that have actually highlighted that families, for example, have greater sense of cohesion or have described themselves greater change in values, change in worldview after such a significant non-normative stressor as a hurricane or cyclone, tsunami, and act in ways that are actually protective of their children. We take that on board as an anecdotal, oh, that's interesting, and yet we program as we did before. The question, I think, is two things, or the surprising point. One is actually the data that we had and we used for this review of pathways, I think, was, even from the quality of the data that was available, was surprisingly weak. And we describe it in the article in terms of some recommendations for how we can improve that. And I think that's a really important aspect of our work collectively as researchers and practitioners. And I think the second surprising thing is, what do we actually do with, if we have these findings and we discuss them, what does that, like, what is then the step for reflection and practice, and how we might carry some of that over?
I have a question that I'll pose to everyone who would like to participate. There's a lot of interest on thinking through how disasters affect experiences of violence, and then what the interventions need to be and how to really adapt and adjust towards different cultures or different influences. For example, if any of you would like to share, what are the considerations that need to be taken into account when understanding how these pathways occur, but then thinking through prevention and response interventions and ensuring that they're culturally appropriate, that they're tailored. For example, picking up, Ranjini, on your comment in your presentation on focusing on prevention because of the stigma for survivors or response services being so strong. And in relation to that, are there any evaluations, Ranjini, specifically for the YABC approach on preventing violence? There's interest in learning more a little bit about that.
Specifically around the YABC, I mean, this is a very youth-led project. I think one of the great things about the IFRC, and I guess I can say this because I'm relatively new to the IFRC, is that we do all of our work in conjunction with the local Red Cross office and the chapter there. So the programming is really driven by local people and local actors that know the context really well. When we work with the youth, a lot of it is around discussing with them what they feel are the most prevalent forms of Sgtp in their community, and working with them to write the play that they feel comfortable sharing in the community. For example, in Laos, as a response to the research that we did in Udomsai and Sekong regions, which are in the north of Laos, where flooding is really common. One of the major and prevalent forms of Sgtp is early marriage. And this is because one major way that instances of rape are handled is by the survivor or victim having to marry their perpetrator. The youth in this community, after going through the Sgtp training and I think discussing some of the norms around this practice, wanted to really find a way to address this with their community. It was a project that we supported in the sense of how can we keep it survivor-centered, how can we keep the children safe when they're performing this play, etc. But it was entirely driven by the community.
The other question was more, what are some of the considerations or other examples on how culture may influence, or other factors specific to a context can influence an intervention such as prevention or response, when keeping in mind these pathways of how disasters affect?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that in every community we have these intersecting forms of marginalization and vulnerability. For example, in Nepal and India, where the caste system is very alive, those are things that we would take into consideration when working with vulnerable groups, that the lower caste members are people that we would target with our programming. Or, for example, the example that I mentioned in Aceh, which is under Sharia law, how do we frame our conversation around Sgtp so that it doesn't look as if we're an outside organization pressing our beliefs into a community, but rather developing and changing our language, even in our training with our own Red Cross Red Crescent staff or the government, on how we approach our discussions around Sgtp, for example, like I mentioned, around in Indonesia specifically, focusing on prevention rather than, I mean, there's a little bit of focus on response, but our major feedback was that the response programming would incur too much negative feedback and too much, it was just essentially too much to do in a short time frame, and that prevention was the key there. So, I mean, those are just some examples. I mean, I think I could talk about this for a long time.
I think that the one point raised by one of the agencies in bringing this up of the underlying vulnerabilities being there, but that specifically women and girls having reduced mobility, I think that is key in sort of a lot of the structuring of interventions, and that, you know, how do we think about the physical space? How do we think about the built environment to ensure that women and girls are not placed in increased risk because there's spaces where they are unable to move to, like they're not very easily able to leave or move to different contexts, within a disaster setting, within a camp, within an affected community. What areas of the built environment are safe or not safe? How do we ensure mixed gender travel? And I know CARE and a couple others have recommended that as an intervention for collecting firewood or water. How do we ensure that that's happening so that women aren't going out far away in these long distances alone? And actually tackling some of the safety elements of the environment, I think that's often useful to think about for structuring interventions.
I would just add to say that the pathways that Ilan so nicely described, these emerged out of the review that we did, but this is just the beginning of the conversation. I mean, I think to position context in the middle would be to actually identify alternative pathways and to understand this notion of equifinality, that many different things can lead to the same outcome, that because we're talking about people and we're social beings and context is complex, we won't necessarily have A will always lead to B and B will always lead to C, and this is how the pathway works. But instead, it's, I think, a point of reflection or an indicator for us to be understanding that pathways will possibly look different in different contexts. The underlying causes will look different. So it's sort of an indicator for us to be open to that and to, in many ways, be open to the unexpected. And I think this poses a particular challenge to our measurement approaches and our measurement instruments, because there's nothing that we like better than a pre-cooked survey or questionnaire that we can just adapt from the global level or others. And I've certainly been part of many of those initiatives, but to really allow space in different environments to pull together questions that might challenge what we already have, but will give us a better understanding of what these pathways are in context.
Our final question here, then we will close, is Ilan and Tina, feel free to kick this one off, and Ranjini, come on in with your thoughts. Why is it important for researchers and practitioners to understand and better explore these pathways between natural disasters and violence?
Thank you, Sonia. I think in general, I mean, there was a very interesting article a few months back in a journal saying, like, basically the equivalent of researchers are from Mars and practitioners are from Venus, like one of these catchy titles, right? That we're approaching these problems in very different ways oftentimes and don't work together enough. And that researchers were really good at finding out the sort of underlying systematic ways of why something is happening. This is what we often do, and practitioners are often, you are on the field implementing these things, have much better knowledge of the firsthand environment of what the reality is. The more that we can actually highlight and bring our skills together and supporting one another, I think is only going to improve the ultimate outcome for people and affected people, and that's ultimately what you both want to do. So I think that's very important, just sort of as a big picture sort of point, but specifically in terms of this topic, I do think that oftentimes with response, as Tina was saying, we go in with our tools and we're responding to as quickly as possible, and there's a time crunch and everyone is trying to get out services as quickly as possible. The extent to which we can step back for a moment and think about, well, how is this actually happening? How is this negative outcome, whatever it may be, violence or something else, how is it happening in this context? How can we take the interventions that we already know very well that work and slightly adapt them or choose the element of the intervention that would be most effective in preventing this negative outcome? And that's kind of our goal in this research piece around pathways, of thinking about these tools. How could we block these numerous ways in which violence happens to prevent it, and thinking about that in our response. Thank you.
So I would just underscore in the same way. So this notion of prevention, unless we know why things are happening, it's very hard to make sure that we're adequately addressing them. And the second thing, to be able to build in indicators for us to monitor our practice. So we have, as Ilan said, a time crunch. Things are very hard. We can't always do assessments. We can leverage secondary data a lot of the times. But how can we use this understanding of pathways and causality and try to build in indicators to work with other sectors and see if we're actually preventing the risk, but also if we're doing more harm than we should be? So those are sort of indicators for practice.
Yeah, I agree with everything that Ilan and Tina have shared. Those are all true And I also think that in Southeast Asia, and of course globally, denial of sexual gender-based violence is common. And among our most well-established humanitarians and practitioners, there can still be the denial that sexual gender-based violence happens at all, and especially in emergencies. So I think sometimes when we say gender inequality and abuse of power, these are really abstract concepts, and sometimes having these concrete contributing factors or pathways, as Ilan and Tina shared, allows for these to be more concrete in people's minds. And I also think that it allows for us to brainstorm together better interventions that also focus on long-term behavioral change, but also some of the shorter-term programming, as in implementing sphere standards in immediate programming and things like that. I think some of this knowledge is really important to share just for it to be more concrete and indisputable in people's minds.
Thank you so much, everyone.